Well, we might as well get started. If people show up late, that's their loss. They won't be able to hear my humorous introduction. Oh, I forgot, I don't have one. Well, I just want to welcome you all to, I'm Dick Snyder, by the way, in case anybody doesn't know. Welcome you to the annual meeting of the Southport Historical Society. And I just want you to know, I'm going to dispense with the minutes by acclamation, if that's all right. Okay. We will do a financial report, however. Becky?
What I did is printed out the report for last year, and then for this year up through June. And I'm going to put copies up on the stage, so if anyone's interested in seeing where we spend our money and where the money comes from. But so far this year we're doing okay. So.
All right. I just want to make an announcement that we have hired a summer intern, a new summer intern for this. Who? Her name. She's not from the island. Her name is Isabel Curtis. She lives over on Atlantic Avenue. She's not one of the Sherman store Curtises, but she seems like a real good choice. So we're very pleased about her. What else did I have to say? We have had a really nice year at the museum. We've had a lot of good things happen, a lot of good donations, and gotten things organized much better than the way they used to be. And no fault of mine, by the way, that they weren't organized or that they were. So anyway, tonight, as advertised, our speaker is Sarah Sherman McGrail. I don't know how many of you know her or know of her, but she's a local girl, born and bred and schooled and the whole thing, and has just had one enterprise after another that she's undertaken. And it's very exciting to see another one. Right now, well, she's a scout, what do they call them, scout mistresses? Master. Scout master for the scout troop here. And she's currently working part-time at New Hope for Women in Wisconsin.
Full-time in Bath.
Full-time in Bath, oh, great. So anyway, so Sarah has put hours and hours and hours into the work that she's going to talk about tonight, and the stuff she's done before as well. So why don't we welcome Sarah? Do you have slides?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jim does. Ready? Okay. Good evening. I'd like to thank the Southport Historical Society for inviting me to be their guest speaker tonight. As a seventh-generation Southport Island native on both my mother and my father's side of the family, I believe that there is a large obligation in not only preserving the island's history, but passing it on to future generations. Tonight I'd like to explain how I started recording our town's history, created my own publishing business, and worked on an extensive historical research project that has resulted in my latest 2 books. It all began 20 years ago with the simple idea of writing down my father, Morris Sherman's, Second World War remembrances for the family history so that they wouldn't be forgotten. This soon blossomed into an island-wide historical project, Southport the War Years, An Island Remembers, which recorded 110 veteran stories in their own words and was self-published in 1996. Luckily, our town had the foresight to keep the Veterans Roll Call on the wall of the Southport Memorial Library. Between that documentation, my parents, my godmother, Jean Thompson, we were able to come up with a complete list of names of the island's veterans, and then it was just a matter of tracking down those who had moved off the island. Ironically, various neighbors' Christmas cards lists became an invaluable resource for locating veterans, as did old Southport columns in the Boothbay Register. In the meantime, Arnie Brewer, a World War II veteran from Boothbay Harbor, who was very involved with the American Legion at the time, approached me at Grover's Hardware and asked if I would consider writing a second veterans book that covered Boothbay, East Boothbay, and Boothbay Harbor. For those of you who knew Arnie Brewer, he was a pretty hard person to say no to, and I realized that this was a very worthwhile project. So I accepted his request with the caveat that once I crossed the Southport Bridge, I didn't know as many people nor their family relations, and I would need his help. I went to the Boothbay Register and asked if I could access their archives, which provided a starting point for the project, because the newspaper ran a veterans roll call every week for the duration of the Second World War. I then recorded all the veterans' names off the Boothbay Center and East Boothbay World War II memorials, and Arnie and I cross-referenced them against the Boothbay Register roll calls. As you can imagine, this process was a bit time-consuming, but in the end, and with a few creative articles asking for the public's assistance, we ended up with a list of 524 veterans, ultimately recording 358 stories, and listing the remaining veterans' names so that they wouldn't be forgotten. 3 years later, in 1999, Heroes Among Us, A History of Boothbay Region Veterans During the Second World War was published. This would probably be a good place to point out that when one writes a manuscript for a book, they need a publisher to print it. I soon came to that realization back in 1995 that because of the age of my veterans, the gamble involved with finding a publisher who would print an unknown author's work, that I was far better off founding my own company, and thus Cozy Harbor Press was born. Luckily, I had my good friend and editor, Esme McTighe, guiding me through the process. By this point, my oldest son, Sherman, was born, and my second son, Jake, was on the way. I continued to write whenever I could steal a minute for myself, and by 2005, I was ready to tackle a different genre and focus my efforts on a Southport Island-based children's book, The Littlest Tugboat. Sherm started taking art lessons from Jim Taliana, and when I showed him the manuscript and asked him if he would be interested in illustrating it for me, he jumped at the chance. A new creative collaborative friendship was born, which lasted many years until Jim passed away unexpectedly a few years ago. In 2006, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Cozy Harbor Press, I published Harbor Journal Volume 1, which featured my writing and other main writers, and won the 2007 Literary Awards Best Self-Published Book. In 2008, Harbor Journal Volume 2 was published, and in it went on to win honorable mention. In 2008, I also published Leroy Battle's second book, And the Beat Goes On. Leroy was a dear friend of mine who met when a customer of mine and my Aunt Em and Uncle Earl's brought in a Washington Post article back in 1996. Leroy's first self-published book, Easier Said, was an autobiography which reflected his service during the Second World War as one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. That day after work, I called Leroy in Maryland, introduced myself, and asked him if he'd like to trade books. And we'd been the best of friends ever since then, up until his death at age 93 in 2015. Of interest, Southport's Dick Johnson, who served as a first lieutenant in the Army Air Corps aboard B-25s in North Africa and Italy, told me that the bomber crews hated to leave the ground in Italy unless they had the Tuskegee Airmen flying with them for cover. They were that good. This has provided you with a brief overview of the last 20 years of my writing and publishing business, which brings us up to speed on my latest project, which covers 8 years' worth of research, and has truly been a labor of love. Looking back, a history of Boothbay Region veterans during the Korean and Vietnam War, Volumes 1 and 2, was finally published this year after much time effort, and proofreading. If I'm really honest, this historical project took on a life of its own, and when my graphic designer, Tim Seymour, called me in the fall of 2015, he said, "Sarah, we've got a problem." I already had a hunch as to why he was calling as I sat at my desk, looking at 7 3-ring binders overflowing with veteran stories from 4 towns and 2 separate wars. And I then learned that without adding their photos, we had 434 veterans, which had created over 700 pages of text. The manuscript was simply too thick to be bound, which meant we would have to split it into 2 volumes. About 7 years into this project, and while checking out at the Southport General Store, I was asked by a Marine Corps veteran who had survived heavy combat in the DMZ during the Vietnam War, "Why do you want to do this?" I hesitated for a moment and said, "Because it's our history, your family's history, our town's history, and if I don't write it down, who will?" The veteran thought for a moment, and a slight smile crossed his face, and he said, "I guess you can send me one of your questionnaires." And with that, he left the store, and I crossed my fingers, hoping that my answer had satisfied him. My mother, Evelyn Sherman, has maintained from the beginning that this is my most important project yet, not because one war is better than another, but because many of the Korean veterans feel forgotten, and many of the Vietnam veterans feel that they were disrespected by their own country. As I started researching this project, I quickly was struck by the realization as to how right my mother was. This isn't just a history, it's an opportunity for healing that's long overdue. For many of my veterans, this is the first opportunity they've had to tell their story in their own words. Some have even described this process as therapeutic. Who knew that while filling out a questionnaire, so many memories would be released? Some good, some bad, but for the most part, I've been told it was a really cathartic experience. Over the course of pulling this book together, which took far longer than anticipated, I met and made friends with many of the veterans and their families, and for this I'm very grateful. They shared their memories with me, photographs, letters, artifacts from the war that held great significance to them. Without this type of uncensored access, I don't think we would have the book that you see here today. And in the words of one Vietnam veteran, "Sarah, a lot of people may not like what I have to say, but that doesn't mean it's not true. It all happened, it was all real, and when I came home, my friends told me I had changed. After going through all that, I suppose they were right. I was a different person." As you read the veteran stories, please keep in mind the sacrifices they have made, leaving home, most at very young ages, for an extended period of time, missing important family events, births, birthdays, weddings, funerals, enduring exposure to extreme cold, tropical heat, serving in a war zone and the stressors that come with that, exposure to Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant, the loss of a buddy, helping the wounded, and the ultimate sacrifice, the loss of their own life. The men and women in these pages are our relatives, spouses, neighbors. There is no way that the events they endured, both stateside and overseas, didn't change them. They matured, learned about responsibility, respect, suffered trauma, and witnessed death. One veteran told me, "We weren't even given the chance to decompress. They put us on an airplane, and within 24 to 48 hours, we were home." At least the guys during the Second World War had a few weeks to talk about their experiences coming back on a ship, or they were sent off to R&R. Most of them were able to get it off their chest before they came home. We just walk around with it, and sometimes it's a terrible burden to bear. At this point in the program, I'd like to discuss a few of the veterans that are featured in my latest books. Many of them are our neighbors, and it was not uncommon for them to serve in not just one war, but 2, and in some cases 3, for those who made a career out of the military. During the Second World War, Dill served with the 106th Infantry during the Battle of the Bulge, was a POW in Germany at Stalag 9B, and was then reinstated for duty during the Korean War, where he served building pontoon bridges and airstrips. You think the Army would have given Dick a break from the action, but that simply wasn't the case, and he went back for his second tour of duty while having young children at home. Harold Weber served as a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, both in World War II and the Korean War, and earned a Bronze Star Medal when his squad of 3 men held their ground and captured 28 German soldiers. Ronald Orchard served in the U.S. Navy as an electrician's mate first class aboard the USS Tarawa, and literally sailed around the world, visiting ports in Cuba, Gibraltar, Italy, France, Monaco, Spain, Algeria, Greece, Turkey, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Hawaii. I believe the saying is, join the Navy, see the world. Newwagon Samuel Emerson served in the U.S. Navy during all 3 wars, ending his career working on Polaris submarines, regulating instruments and periscopes. Carl Pierce served in all 3 wars in the U.S. Navy aboard the USS Princeton and as the Navy's first Master Chief later in his military career. My uncles Elbridge and Sidney served both during the Second World War and Korean War in the Coast Guard and the Army Air Corps. Southport's own Myrtle Seavey First was one of the first women Marines in the United States during the Second World War, and when her company was reactivated during the Korean War, she returned to service. The slogan, "Free a Marine to Fight," was a popular recruiting tool for women during that time period. Brothers Gordon and Albion Tibbetts both served their country during the Korean War. Gordon with the 24th Division, 8th Army in Korea, guarding prisoner of war camp, and Albion in the 25th Division, 8th Army, as a platoon sergeant with the infantry on the front lines. Ernest Thibault served with the 109th Regiment, 28th Infantry, and was stationed in Germany, which allowed him to travel across Europe by train, an experience he cherishes to this day. Robert Eaton served in Germany as part of the Army of Occupation and attended the Nuremberg war crime trials. He too was pulled back into the Korean War and trained troops headed for Korea in winter tactics and maneuvers, and was then sent to the Panama Canal with the 33rd Infantry Division as a line officer. His mission was to keep the canal open. During the Vietnam War, Southport Islanders continued in their long tradition of military service, as seen in Sumner Rand's 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division. He was featured in Associated Press Thanksgiving Day photo while eating his meal in a foxhole, which, according to his sister Lois, led to mail arriving from all over the country, simply addressed to Sumner Rand, somewhere in Vietnam. When American families saw the stark and striking image, it reminded them of their sons who were also serving in the war. Sumner also later started a second career in security at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, and was friendly with the former president and first lady. For those of you privileged enough to attend the Southport Central School back in the 70s, you will remember Sumner's mother, Helen, who worked side by side with Ramona Gaudet, preparing fantastic lunches for us every day while simultaneously breaking into song and dance. Raymond Sweat served with Delta Company, 4th Battalion, 21st Infantry, 11th Brigade, Americal Division, and his story describes in great detail the Vietnam experience for the infantry soldier. His interaction with Vietnam villagers whose teeth were stained black from chewing betel nuts, watching the distressed look on Bob Hope's face while he was performing a USO show and critically wounded soldiers were being medevaced into the base, having to take lead while patrolling through heavily booby-trapped areas of the jungle, dealing with malaria, snakes, leeches, and cuts from elephant grass, finding a North Vietnamese hospital in the jungle that had running water by a bamboo that had split in half to form a series of gutters, and enduring monsoon season, which made our main hurricane seem minor as it rained for days on end. Skip Rideout put his island know-how to good use when he enlisted in the Navy Seabees and served as a steelworker, 3rd class in Vietnam, with a construction battalion maintenance unit. His sister Mary Ann didn't want Skip to miss out on a Maine Christmas, so she mailed him a 3-foot-tall fir tree complete with lights. It was the hit of the base and definitely the best care package I've ever documented. Skip Williams served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Saw Bob Hope perform with the USO, vividly described Raquel Welch, what she was wearing to this day, and survived the Tet Offensive. During the Vietnam War, Tommy Blake served in the Navy, Peter Brewer in the Air Force, brothers John, Robert, and William Buck all served in the Air Force, Mark Colby served on the icebreaker North Wind in the Coast Guard, and my cousin Roland Sherman served aboard the weather cutter and his namesake, the Sherman. Norman Lewis Jr. served with the U.S. Army 7th Division in Korea during the Vietnam War. Timmy Rigo served with the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Regiment, and 3rd Marine Division. He was assigned to a mortar crew and went out on different missions with Lima, Mike, Kilo, and India companies, spending time on the DMZ or patrolling Mudder's Ridge, the Rock Pile, Cam Low, Leatherneck Square, and surrounding areas. Jim Singer served in Vietnam as a first lieutenant with the 3rd Marine Division, 3rd Battalion, 4th Regiment, where Leatherneck Square soon became his new home, patrolling the 54-mile square area with his platoon from Dong Ha to Cam Lo in the south and to Gio Lin and Con Tien in the north. Jim has one of the best photographic collections of the Vietnam War that this author has ever experienced, not only because he had a good photographic eye, but because the images were all dated and labeled. As he shot the film, he sent it to Becky stateside with a list of what was on each roll. Roger Drinkwater, Harold Simmons, Eugene Stover Jr. also served in the U.S. Navy. And lastly, let us not forget Eddie Tibbetts, who served in Vietnam with C Company, 3rd Battalion, 12th Infantry, 4th Infantry Division, who had been in Vietnam for just 5 weeks when he was wounded on January 20th, 1968 by an AK-47. He had multiple fragment wounds, and a comrade near Eddie's bullet-ridden body dragged him backwards to get him out of the line of fire. While his friend attempted to get him to safety, an enemy grenade exploded nearby, hitting Eddie and further damaging his lower left leg and foot. Eddie was transported by helicopter to an evacuation hospital, then to a hospital in Japan, and a 3rd hospital in San Francisco. Finally, on February 9th, 1968, he was transported to Valley Forge General Hospital in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. It was there that Eddie recuperated for the next 14 months, enduring multiple operations and procedures. His family traveled from Southport, Maine once a week to visit him. Keep in mind that the trip was 490 miles, or 10 hours one way. Eventually, Eddie went back to school at Central Maine Technical Institute in Auburn, Maine, but his health worsened and he had to withdraw from the classes. He was also elected in 1972 to serve as a Southport town selectman, but had to resign in 1973 due to his health. He married Karen Conley of Monmouth, Maine in the spring of 1969, and they had 2 sons, Vance and Victor. Over a period of time, the complications of Eddie's injuries finally caught up with him, and he passed away on May 25th, 1975, at the age of 28 as a result of his wounds. Thanks to Eddie's cousin, Arnold Tibbetts, and his persistence, Eddie's name can be found on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. Wall panel, line 34E, 85. It was added in 1997 upon verification that he had died as a result of his injuries sustained during the Vietnam War. During Southport Central School's class of 2012 6th grade trip to Washington, D.C., my son Jake and his classmates made a rubbing of Eddie's names, and we paid our respects. At the time, a lasting impression was made with all of us as we looked at the thousands of names on the Vietnam Memorial, including Johnny Sawyer and Gordon Tibbetts of Booth Bay Harbor. This really struck a chord as to the importance of remembrance with not just the children, but the adults. Perhaps after hearing these stories, the significance of our small town's Memorial Day parade will take on more meaning as well. In ending, I'd like to stress the significance of recording our town's history for prosperity, its people, its buildings, its military service, and its events. If you go back and flip through the pages of Southport the War Years, you will find that there are only a handful of the 110 World War II veterans left whose stories were recorded in 1996. To put that in perspective, all of that 1940s island history would have been lost if it hadn't been recorded. We all bear a responsibility to this island and to its future generations. That is why we must preserve its history. The Hendricksville Museum and its trustees do a magnificent job year after year, and I'd like to thank them for all their efforts and for inviting me here to speak tonight. Thank you.
Would you entertain questions?
I was going to say, does anyone have any questions?
What's next?
That's a good question. Right now, I'm sort of enjoying what's happening with the two new books. I have several book signings lined up and speaking engagements, but I don't sit still for very long, so I will be back at the typewriter or computer keyboard shortly, I'm sure.
Do you think the process that you went through would work in other locations? And what mechanism can you think of that would make that happen?
I absolutely think it would work in other locations. I encourage it to work in other locations, and I have offered freely the questionnaire that I use, what I call the skeleton, to getting the base facts for the story to any town that asks for it. The key piece is you have to have someone that's willing to sit and do the interviews. I've even entertained the idea that perhaps high school senior classes ought to be recording the stories in each of our towns. And I gladly offer any assistance to groups or organizations or schools that would like to try to do this. I think it's a real shame that it's not being done.
Have you been able to reach out to some of the national veterans associations to share with them what you've been able to do in the hopes of kind of getting it recognized more broadly?
I have not directly reached out, say, to the American Legion or the VFW. I have several friends here on the peninsula that have ties to those organizations, and I'm guessing I could do that. We'll see what happens.
I would think it would be of great interest, and it would spur others to do similar things. I think there's nothing better than a success story to breed other efforts. It's a remarkable thing you've done.
Well, thank you. It really was a labor of love. And I had one veteran in particular write me a letter, which I will save and cherish forever. And he said, you sent me this questionnaire, and I started to fill it out, and he just was overcome with emotion. And it made him think of a lot of things he hadn't thought of in a long time. And he wrote to me and said, for 46 years, I've not talked about this. My family never asked. I didn't want to talk about it. And he made an appointment at the VA and went and got diagnosed finally with PTSD and is getting help for that. And for 46 years endured not nightmares, but night terrors. And he said in his letter, they have not gone away, but they have lessened. So to me, that is a real accomplishment. Yes.
Sarah, your dad was in the service,
Yes.
and I think he was not around and available for this series of books, was he? In other words, he's not included?
Well, he's in the first one. He's why I started, yes. Okay. Yeah. When growing up in the Sherman household, we knew 5 things. Dad was an Army veteran. Dad was wounded. Dad served in North Africa and Italy. He was a forward observer, and we all twirled our spaghetti with a spoon because he learned to eat spaghetti in Rome. That was it. My kids, this goes for generations now. We all do it. So I badgered Dad to tell me his story, and that is what started all of this.
Sarah, was Norman Carter in the first book?
He is.
Okay, he was killed in the war on Veterans Day.
He was one of 3 from Southport that were killed in action. Yes. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm really interested, partly because I was a forward observer, too. And I knew your dad was, and I didn't realize it was in your first book. But I have it at home, and I'll go find out about it.
Yes.
But I just wonder, if he also was a medal winner, was he not?
Yeah, my father's Purple Heart decorated. He was wounded in Italy while acting as a forward observer. He was had gone up an Italian mountain, and it was too foggy, so they radioed back. There was nothing to report. The German army decided they would just start firing, even though they couldn't see. A shell exploded in front of Dad and hit him in the ankle, but the barrage lasted all night, so his two friends stayed with him on either side of him. He had gone into shock and tried to keep him warm and stop the bleeding as best they could, and then took him down what was the equivalent of a mule trail, mountainside mule trail, and he was operated on in like a MASH unit at the base of this mountain, and just by chance there was a new doctor there who had learned a nerve grafting technique back in the States, and Dad was his first patient to try this on, and if he hadn't had this doctor, he would have lost his foot.
Harold Weber told me he met your dad. Partly, I think they must have known each other before the war, surely. But Harold was a Bronze Star winner, I believe, World War II.
Yes.
And he told me about your dad. And so I've always sort of wondered about him. And I wondered if he played any role in all this. It is strange that I have not looked in your first book to see, in fact, if he was there.
Yeah, I mean...
It raises this sort of point I really want to make by asking about your dad. I want, first of all, to ask you to talk about your dad a little bit. You've done that, and I think that's really great. But it is for this project, which is down the road, that I know you'll have another project. What I wanted to encourage you to think about was how families don't wait around for another war. See how other people have experienced the whole process, perhaps. Just a thought. And how you experienced it through your dad. What you learned, what your mom learned. It may be a way to go, and might allow other people to express things they want to say.
Yeah, I mean, during the interview process, I interacted with the family members as well, and I can't tell you how many wives on this peninsula do not wake their husbands by tapping them on the shoulder. To this day, I have one woman who uses a broom handle because they still have that reaction to, jump up, and it's not always good. When you've lived through a traumatic event, whether it's a war experience or a natural disaster, that trauma is ingrained in your senses, and it just appears without warning. And it affects everybody, friends, family, neighbors.
Sarah, can you tell them a little bit about Peter Hall and his story? I know he's not from Southport, but he's a local boy.
Yeah, absolutely. During the course of my research, I always kind of kept my ears open for side stories. And one of my veterans, Peter Hall from Boothbay, mentioned his friend Vito Baker. And Vito was Hawaiian, actually, with this great name. And they had known each other in Vietnam, but had lost track of each other when Peter was sent stateside. So I kind of kept this note on my desk, find Vito Baker. And I just started, I Googled it, and I couldn't really find anything. And I talked to Becky because she does a lot of genealogy, and she found an obituary that listed him as a family member, so we knew he was alive. And I just kept thinking about it. It just kind of stuck with me. And then I contacted my cousin in Hawaii, and I said, well, you're right there. Check out this name for me. And within an hour, he called me back. He goes, I found him. I go, well, where is he? He said, well, he's in Arizona. And he's a volleyball coach at a high school. So I called the school that day and said, I know this sounds strange, but is Vito Baker there by any chance? So they put me through to the athletic department. And I said, I don't expect you to give out his phone number, but would you give him this message? And a couple hours later, I got a phone call, and it was Vito, and he was thrilled. So I called up Peter's wife, and I said, could I come up this afternoon? And she said, sure. And so over I went, and we sat down at the kitchen table, and I said, Peter, I found Vito. I said, could I sit here while you call him? And we called him, and they picked up just as right where they left off. And he's like, Baker, it's me, Peter. And off they went, and I looked at his wife, and I said, well, cheer up. Now you don't have to buy a ticket to Hawaii, just one to Arizona. Yeah. The other, I might as well tell the other instance. My cousin Vicky's husband, Ernie, who is our cover veteran on Volume 1, had a good friend, and Juan Rojas, who was from Guam. And Ernie also had a fantastic photo collection, mostly slides from the war. And there was this one picture, and this guy's just smiling into the camera. I mean, the circumstances are bleak. I mean, it's just dry, and, you know, there's sandbags and tents, and, you know, it's not the greatest place to be, but it was their circumstance. And I said, who's this guy, Ernie? And he said, he goes, well, that's my friend Ron. Hell of a nice guy. And so again, here came the note on my desk, find Juan. So I dug, and I again used Google, and I found his name on a petition to create a Vietnam Veterans Highway in Guam. So I knew he had gone back to Guam, because this is the thing, these veterans don't always land back where they started. So I dug, and I found a Vietnam veterans group for Guam. So I sent them an email and told them who I was. And sure enough, couple days, I got a hit. We'll send this out not just to our organization, but all the other veteran societies on the island. So about 11:30 one night, phone rings. Of course, I think something's wrong. It's so late at night, and I hop out of bed. I grab the phone, and this voice says, hello, Sarah, this is Rosie Perez calling from Guam. And she said, let me see what I can do, but can you send a picture? And I said, okay. So I sent an email to my graphic artist. He sent me the picture. I sent it to her the next day. So in the meantime, Rosie is telling her husband, well, this woman from Maine is looking for a guy from Guam, and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, what's the name? And she said, Juan Rojas. And he goes, well, I went to high school with his sister. So sure enough, they showed him the picture, and I ID'd it. And unfortunately, Juan had passed away, but we found his sister, his cousin, and his 4 sons. So those were my 2 success stories. And the third note, and perhaps the most important, on my desk, 3 of my veterans did not receive their medals. Dennis Andrews, a Bronze Star, Barry Sherman, Purple Heart, and Pat Farron, 2nd Purple Heart. So once the research was done and the book was literally out the door to the printer, I decided we ought to do something about that. So I went to the veterans and told them I knew someone at Senator Collins' office, and could I push a little bit? And they all said, go for it, Sarah. We've waited all this time. So I contacted my friend Chuck, who I know through Scouts, and I said, what do you need? And he said, well, send me their stories, and that they'd like a letter saying they'd like their medals. So off went the stories, pictures included. And interestingly, Pat actually has photographic evidence of the rocket attack, and then he's standing there wounded with his hand bandaged. So off this went to Chuck, and I got an email back that said, this is the best evidence we've ever received. And this started the process rolling. Dennis's story is unique in that he was awarded his Bronze Star in Vietnam, and he said, send it home to my mother. And they did, and someone stole it out of the mail, but kept the box going. So his mother opened it, and it was an empty medals box. So within about 4 weeks, I received the good news that Dennis would be awarded his Bronze Star, and how would we like to do this? And so I said, so what are you doing in 2 Saturdays? And so Chuck came down to our party for the veterans, and we gave Dennis the task of taking care of the antique autos out in the parking lot so we could get set up. And we surprised Dennis with his Bronze Star. And It was really a great moment. It's something I'm very proud of. And we are still working on Barry's and Pat's, and I hope to have an update that we have success on both of their behalfs, but it may take a while. Any other questions?
Well,
Okay, thank you.
it's been really wonderful.
Thank you for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now,
Oh.